Hey everybody, I'm Bijan from PM Exercises, and today we have Alicia, one of the users of PM Exercises who use our platform to prepare for a Google Product Manager job interview that was successful. Alicia is actually joining Google pretty soon in their Google, is it Google Cloud team that you're joining?
No, it's Geo Enterprise, so it's part of Maps.
Got it. Google Geo Enterprise as part of the Google Maps team, which is great. Well, first of all, congratulations. I'm
Thank
very
you.
excited to have one more success story. We're going to do some behavioral interview questions together because behavioral interview questions still matter to the recruiters. And these are one of these types of questions that are actually easy to do well with the right practice. But before we get started, we'd love to have you, Alicia, introduce yourself and tell us what you've been up to and how you prepared for your interview.
Sure. Thanks for having me. To prepare for this particular interview, I used PM Exercises and a couple of other sites to basically look at frameworks, do some practice, try and get some examples of what to expect in the interview. As far as my background, I was a technical program manager for several years, made the switch to product when I went to a startup that I was most recently at, and wanted to continue that in that role at Google. So that's why I focused on that particular role rather than technical program management. And I'm happy to start there at the end of the month.
That's very exciting. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
So we'll just like jump right into it. We're going to do a few behavioral interview questions. So I'll start up with the first one. Describe a time where you influenced the manager.
The time that I influenced a manager, and actually several managers, was when I was at Google before as a program manager. And I was in charge of a new program that was basically expanding mapping into places of the world that Google hadn't spent much time mapping before. So, for example, we started in Lagos, Nigeria. And this program was basically trying to take the cost of map building down so we could scale in a bigger across more geographies and more quickly. So what did I have to do to influence people? First, what I needed to do was really think about the value proposition. So why would a team spend time on this program when there was already established programs? And basically what this was an opportunity for engineering teams to scale what they had been doing, to test out some of the algorithms in new and unique places, and also to just kind of prove out that algorithms could do more of the mapping than we had before. And also I think the biggest factor was we were able to show that there are a lot of potential users in these markets. So it was an opportunity to touch on a product for new users in new markets and show a lot of impact. So what I did in that process is I basically met with every single manager of the engineering teams I wanted to work with and did this pitch about why they should do it, how it's going to help their teams, how it's going to help the product overall, and how it's going to be beneficial to Google and also potentially societally beneficial. So that was a lot of me sitting down with managers, having coffee, talking about it, coming up with specific asks for what I wanted their team to do and why. And as far as like what ended up happening as a result was I was able to get a little bit of time from all these teams, and we were able to incrementally expand on the program. And over about a 6-month period, we went from mapping one city to 50. And then the next 6 months, we went from 50 to 150 cities. And then it became the geodata level OKR for 2019. So it ended up being a really successful program, but I think a lot of it was influencing early on, showing value, and then also giving tangible results to these teams that had contributed. So they were interested in, continuing to work with us.
Can you give an example of how one of those meetings went, where you met with an engineering manager and how you influenced them and kind of brought them on board?
The first meetings didn't always go well, I'll say that. So basically what I would do is I actually, pre-COVID times, flew down to Mountain View, scheduled time with these folks, and just kind of introduced myself, talked about why I was meeting with them, talked about what it was we were trying to do and how it would be beneficial. And then usually what ended up happening after that was a series of follow-up meetings being like, hey, remember this thing we talked about? Could you guys do this? Could you do this very specific thing? And here's why we're asking for it. And, if you could do it in the next 3 weeks, that'd be great. So those kinds of like influencing without authority and, basically like building a relationship with folks to bring them along and have them see the value in, what I'm asking them to do. So it was a lot of just like laying groundwork and a lot of trips to Mountain View and, a lot of, talking to folks.
Thanks for that. So I really like the answer because it was like such a easy to follow answer with a really good framework of you started describing the situation. You highlighted exactly what the challenge was. Then you went over your task of you were trying to basically get some buy-in and get this rolled out. Then you talked about the things you did, flying down, meeting with people, like giving them updates. And then finally, you really described the positive outcome in a very, very quantitative way, which makes it easy for people to relate to and say, yeah, the outcome of this project was a success. So I think that's really great. Thank you for that. Let's try one more question.
Sure.
Describe your biggest success.
The program I just described was one, but I'll talk about a different one that was earlier in my career that I'm proud of because it was both a technical success and also a kind of people success. So when I worked for a company called Weyerhaeuser, we were basically trying to take ground-based inventory. So this is a forestry company. So we had to go, count the number of trees basically. And we used to do that with people. And the project was to use LiDAR, which is a remotely sensed, three-dimensional point cloud collected from an airplane to create an inventory based off of that rather than sending humans out in the woods to count trees and do a bunch of statistics. So my role in that was as a subject matter expert. It was right out of grad school. I had studied LiDAR in forestry as my master's program. So a lot of what I was doing was working with folks who were biometricians to take traditional forest inventory methodologies and translate them into tech, and then taking those ideas and getting programmers to program it, and then running the whole thing. So I would get a terabyte of data, which doesn't seem like a lot now, but in 2008 was quite a bit, and transform it into several gigabytes of basically relational database rows that represented our forest inventory. And I got to work across all of these different groups, innovating, prototyping, kind of project managing the pieces being built. And what ended up happening was we built a 5-step process for processing that involved taking this data, running a bunch of really sophisticated models on it, and getting it into our database and running reports and showing an inventory for a forest area, which was approximately 1 million acres. So it was a pretty big deal, and we were able to take something that was very complex and put it into a easy to use process that I was actually able to hand off to someone else towards the end of my time there. And so the result was that we were able to save the company approximately $1 million every year, which for that particular industry is a lot of money. And also another thing that came out of it was the team that I was on ended up getting what's called the President's Award, which was like a company level award for innovation or just something that was a big deal. So we basically were able to, over a 2-year period, save the company $1 million annually, establish a brand new way to do forest inventory, and also be recognized for our team performance in innovation through this award.
That's a really good example. And I like it because it also speaks to your kind of interest in using technology to get rid of manual work. Right. I think it's very relevant to kind of Google's approach, and also Google is all about data management, and I think your answer really speaks to that. You've kind of been able to use your skills and the rest of the team to come up with basically a way of kind of digitizing the process of counting these trees. So really interesting answer. Thank you for that. And you still follow the STAR method, which I've spoken to in other videos. The STAR method is really the right way to do to answer a behavioral interview question. Start with the situation, really describe what situation you're in, then talk about what task you were assigned with, and then talk about what you actually did, and finally the result. And it's so easy to just like kind of follow the story the way you are going through the steps, because I kind of see where it got started and how everything ended up. And you ended up with with an award and like $1 million saving. It's like as specific as it could get, which is really good. So thank you for that.
Sure.
One more question we're going to do is describe a time where you spoke to your customers or your users.
So in my most recent experience at a startup, I was a product manager for the high definition maps for autonomous vehicles. And we had a couple of big OEM customers that we were doing prototypes for. And there was a couple different aspects about speaking to these customers that I found interesting in a learning experience. One was having technical discussions with folks on their side that weren't always the most technical, like the technical people in the room. So these were kind of like account managers or folks that maybe didn't have like the depth of mapping expertise to have a conversation about very specific things about. And then the second one was talking to them about the requirements they had for their model, and basically pushing back on what we thought was appropriate or not appropriate. So they were asking for the sun and the moon and the stars, and we're like, yeah, we can really only give you the sun. So so those are the two specific things. So thinking about having technical conversations with non-technical folks, a lot of what I did was try to think about how to tell it in a story that relates to something that was common and they could understand. So for example, like trying to talk to them about lane line accuracy and, is that important? So you can, basically what I did was, talk about like, imagine you're in an autonomous vehicle and you're going down the road and you see lane lines and, you're 5 centimeters off. What does that do for you? And how big is 5 centimeters? And, relate it to something that, is something they could easily understand, and really talk them through kind of, here's the scenario, here's the thing that we're running into, and here's the impact it will have. And that impact was also very important because that was the part they cared about. Like, will this impact the ability of the autonomous vehicle to navigate the world? Yes or no? So really telling a story and being able to make it relatable and avoiding using very specific technical terms that most people may not be familiar with. The second part was talking a little bit to their more technical staff about the requirements they had asked for in their model. And so I think what was happening was they were trying to anticipate every possible condition in the real world and include it in their model, which made for a very complex and very difficult model to actually build and build a map to. So what I was able to do was work with our engineering team and be like, hey, what are the things that you guys have questions about? Where are the complexities and why is it complex? And what would you think that we should do instead? And so once I had those conversations with our engineers, I was able to go back to their technical staff and pose a scenario to them saying, hey, like you're asking for weather on every road segment. This is actually very difficult to get, and we think it's better that it's collected by the sensors on the vehicle, and it will be more accurate than us providing it as part of the model. And are you guys okay with that? And most of the time the answer was, oh yeah, totally. We just put that in there because we thought it'd be neat or something like that. So it's really about telling a story, explaining the why, and explaining the impact. And then I think the other really important part that I found in talking to customers was having a viable alternative right off the bat. Because like if you're talking to customers and you say, hey, this thing's really hard to do, what do you want us to do? That's a very different conversation than, hey, this thing is tough, here's why, and we think we could do it better this way. Are you guys okay with that? And generally that second way, they're like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. But if you don't lead with like an alternate, you can go down a rabbit hole. It puts you in a very different, it puts you on your heels a bit. And I think it's important to like, when you're working, especially with external customers, to be able to show like, hey, we've thought about this. We know it's important to you. And here's, the thing that we thought through that will meet your needs in a different way.
Yeah. So I really like this answer as well. I think that it's pretty clear to me, if I was interviewing you, that you have very strong communication skills because you talk to how you would translate or abstract the technical complexities to a somebody who has got a business background or is more on the user-facing side, or they're not familiar with the technical side so much. And you're able to kind of adjust your strategy and your communications for people that are more technical, and you're kind of able to speak to them as well. And that's a very good skill set to have as a product manager, because you're constantly dealing with like so many different people. You're getting pulled in so many different directions every day. So that's really good to see that you're kind of able to deal with both of these types of people. I think I can definitely see why Google made you a job offer.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you so much. And, at the end, I'd love to know if you have any feedback or any, tips for people that are preparing for their PM interviews. How do you think they should prepare for their interviews? What are some of the tips that come to your mind?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, for me, especially coming from a technical program management background into product management, is the value of storytelling and having the ability, both in your interview and in your job, to tell a story about the thing you're describing or the question you're answering. And so you really want to be able to, and as an interviewer, having interviewed several people, the most interesting interviews are ones where the interviewee is able to bring you along, where they've engaged you, where they've given you enough information to be interested in what's happening. So I think the tip to get there is really a lot of practice, like practice with your friends, practice in the mirror, practice with something like PM exercises, and practice that storytelling ability and that the funnels that you describe in your site, and using something like the STAR format for behavioral questions to really like, here's the beginning, the middle, the end, here's why you should care. So really thinking about that, and like, how do you engage the person that is interviewing you so they're interested and they like you and they want to hire you.
Makes sense. How about the part where you have to prepare for like product sense or like execution questions? Because I could be kind of an outlier, but I find that behavioral questions are fairly easy to do well on if you practice, because once you get comfortable with the STAR method and you write down your answer to a bunch of situation-based questions, you can probably apply them to many interview questions and many cases that come up. But I think that's a little bit different than the traditional product management interview questions, like, how would you improve Google Maps or something else, because it could go in so many different directions. So I'm curious to know how you prepared for them, and if you have any tips in that area as well.
Sure, yeah. So for those types of questions, I think actually your frameworks were actually super helpful in that they gave a nice kind of funnel of like, clarify the question, do these kinds of things. And again, I think it just goes back to practice. And I think the biggest insight I had in thinking about getting ready for the product manager interview is that there is no way you're going to be able to understand or have clarity of all the possible topics they could ask you about. So rather focus on the method and how you would go about breaking down, any kind of random question that they would throw at you. So I think what I did was I created some cheat sheets that were basically like kind of the different aspects of the frameworks for each type of question. I use those cheat sheets to do practices, and then I also looked at the examples from folks on the community pages. So I think it's really like getting comfortable with those frameworks, not so much the subject matter, and putting yourself in the shoes of a customer. I mean, that's super important as a product manager, no matter what. But any question being like, okay, Google Maps, who uses Google Maps? How do they use Google Maps? What are the things that bothers me about using Google Maps? What are the things that are good? So I think it's really just building that that muscle of being able to break down complex questions in a methodical way that was most helpful.
That makes sense. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. This was
Of
really
course.
helpful. There's a lot of value in your advice, and I'm so glad to hear that you were successful in landing a job at Google. And again, good luck with your job. And for everybody who watched this video, thank you so much. Hope to see you soon.
All right. Thank you.